Tonight, we are going to do something that sounds slightly unwise but historically appropriate. We are going to spend the night in a medieval castle and try, with dignity if possible, not to freeze to death. This is less glamorous than it sounds. Castles in modern imagination tend to arrive with glowing fireplaces, thick velvet curtains, romantic torchlight, and a sort of permanent background music, suggesting that everyone is one goblet away from either a feast or a dramatic confession. The real thing was much more interested in stone, smoke, drafts, damp wool, and the quiet realization that comfort had not yet been properly invented. Still, people did sleep in castles, and most of them managed to wake up again, which is historically encouraging. So, if you ever wondered how men, women, children, servants, soldiers, guests, lords, ladies, and the occasional visiting cleric got through a medieval winter night without turning into decorative ice sculpture, the answer is not one clever trick. It is an entire layered system of architecture, textiles, habits, hierarchy, body heat, routine, resignation, and the ancient human ability to say, "This is terrible," and then fall asleep anyway. And yes, before we get too cold too quickly, do remember to quietly subscribe if this sort of drafty misery helps you sleep. The first thing to understand is that castles were not built to be cozy. They were built to be defensible. That sounds obvious, but it matters. A castle existed to withstand attack, control territory, project authority, and remind anyone nearby that someone powerful lived here and could, if necessary, drop rocks on them. Thick stone walls were excellent for defense. They were less excellent at the sort of domestic warmth later generations would come to expect from actual homes. Stone has a steady, patient way of holding cold. In winter, it absorbed the chill and then radiated it back into the room as if personally offended by your optimism. A great hall might look impressive during the day, with banners overhead and firelight dancing against walls, but once the fire died down and the night settled in, all that open space became a chamber for cold air, smoke residue, and mild regret. Even the more private chambers in a castle were not sealed against the weather in the modern sense. Windows were often narrow and sometimes shuttered, but glass was expensive and not always present, especially in earlier periods or less wealthy residences. A shutter could block wind and rain to a degree, but not completely. Gaps around frames, joints in timber, cracks in stonework, and simple structural imperfection all allowed air to move. Medieval people were very familiar with indoor wind. They did not call it air circulation. They called it a Tuesday in January. So when people slept in castles without freezing to death, they did not rely on heating the whole building. That would have been nearly impossible. Instead, they concentrated warmth where it mattered most, around the body, around the bed, and around the routines of night. In other words, they did not make the castle warm. They made the sleeper less exposed to the castle. This distinction is doing a great deal of work. Now, not everyone in a castle slept the same way, because castles were not just households. They were layered societies under one roof. A lord and lady might have a chamber with relatively better furnishing, thicker hangings, and a proper bedstead. Their children, depending on age and custom, might sleep nearby with attendants or in adjoining rooms. Important guests might be given a reasonably respectable chamber, which is medieval for not directly above the noisy bits. Household officers, chaplains, clerks, ladies-in-waiting, and favored retainers might sleep in smaller but still sheltered rooms. Servants often slept where duty placed them, in side rooms, lofts, storage-adjacent spaces, corridors near chambers, or on pallets close to the hall. Soldiers and guards might sleep in barracks-like conditions, gatehouses, towers, or any place practical enough to allow both rest and readiness. In short, the question, how did people sleep in medieval castles, has several answers because people includes the entire social pyramid, and medieval architecture never wasted an opportunity to remind you where on that pyramid you happen to be. Still, the basic strategies for warmth show up again and again. One major strategy was the bed itself, because the medieval bed was not merely furniture. It was a climate control device, a status symbol, a textile fortress, and sometimes one of the most expensive objects in a room. We are especially talking here about the bed of someone wealthy, because the better the rank, the better the insulation. A proper medieval bed could stand high off the floor on a wooden frame with a mattress stuffed from materials such as straw, flock, feathers, wool, or down, depending on wealth. On top came layers, sheets, blankets, coverlets, furs, quilts, and sometimes rich outer coverings that displayed status as much as practicality. The elevation mattered because floors could be bitterly cold, especially stone floors. Getting the bed off the ground reduced direct exposure to that cold surface and also kept the sleeper slightly away from drafts moving low across the room. This is one of those rare moments when being socially elevated and physically elevated aligned rather neatly. Around the bed, hangings or curtains could be drawn, not for theatrical effect, though they do photograph well in manuscripts, but to trap a pocket of warmer air around the sleeper. Bed curtains mattered enormously in cold environments. A four-poster or canopied bed created a smaller interior space. Your body heat, and the heat retained in blankets and bedding had less volume to warm. Even in a chilly room, the curtained bed could be several degrees more tolerable than the chamber itself. Medieval people did not need modern thermal engineering to grasp that enclosing a small space around the body was smarter than arguing with a stone wall. Curtains also offered privacy, which was a luxury in crowded households, but warmth was no small part of their value. When you see images of grand medieval beds with elaborate testers overhead and curtains all around, you're not just seeing ceremony. You're seeing winter strategy in embroidered form. The choice of bedding materials mattered too. Wool was indispensable. It retained warmth well even when conditions were less than ideal, and it was widely available. Linen sheets might be used closer to the body by those who could afford them, but linen alone would not save anyone from a castle night. Blankets and coverlets layered over the sleeper did the real work, and fur added another level of insulation for elites. Squirrel, marten, fox, and other pelts appear in records and inventories, not merely because people enjoyed soft, expensive things, though obviously they did, but because fur trapped heat effectively. Feathers in mattresses or bedding added softness and insulation, though not everyone could afford that level of comfort. Poorer individuals or ordinary servants might make do with straw mattresses, rougher blankets, cloaks, and whatever spare textile layers could be arranged without provoking official complaint. And because warmth depended on layers, thin clothing often remained part of the sleeping system. People did not necessarily undress into airy little garments. that would delight a costume department. Night attire could involve shirts, shifts, caps, stockings, and extra wrappings as needed. Sleeping naked in a stone chamber in midwinter would have been less a lifestyle choice than a brief experiment. Head coverings were particularly important because heat loss from the head and discomfort from cold air on the face and ears were both very real. Nightcaps were practical, common, and deeply uncinematic. Medieval dignity often looked like a bundle of wool with opinions. Another critical strategy was the use of hangings and textiles in the room itself. Castles, especially important ones, often used tapestries, wall hangings, or wooden paneling to improve interior comfort. Modern visitors sometimes admire tapestries primarily as art. Medieval inhabitants admired them as insulation that happened to tell a story. A large textile hanging against a stone wall created a barrier between the cold masonry and the room's interior air. It reduced radiant chill and cut some of the draft effect. It also made a room feel less bleak, which is not a measurable thermal unit, but remains useful when one is trying to sleep, while the building resembles a refrigerated monastery. Rich households traveled with tapestries and bedding when moving between residences, which tells you how central portable comfort was. A chamber was not truly prepared until it was dressed with fabric. Stone alone announced power. Stone plus cloth announced that power intended to sleep. Fire, naturally, also played a role, though perhaps less magically than we imagine. Most medieval heating came from hearths and fireplaces, but heating a castle chamber was uneven and inefficient by modern standards. The great hall's central hearth, in earlier periods, sent much of its heat upward and plenty of its smoke everywhere else. Later, wall fireplaces with chimneys were an improvement, but still localized. You were warm near the fire and increasingly philosophical the farther away you moved. Private chambers for the lord or lady might have fireplaces, making them substantially more habitable than common sleeping areas. But even there, the fire was not necessarily kept blazing all night. Fuel cost labor. Fire required tending. Sparks could be dangerous. Smoke control was imperfect. So rather than relying on a continuous night-long blaze in every room, and people often used the fire to warm the chamber before bed, warm bedding equipment, dry garments, and make the general environment survivable long enough for bed curtains and blankets to take over. In some cases, braziers could be used, especially in smaller rooms, but these came with obvious risks: fire hazard, smoke, fumes, and the medieval tendency to discover safety standards only after a regrettable event. Even so, a heated object near the bed could make a real difference. One wonderfully practical device was the warming pan. Essentially, a metal pan on a handle filled with hot coals and passed between the sheets before sleeping. It sounds both ingenious and mildly alarming, which is exactly what it was. The aim was to take the sharp cold out of the bed before the sleeper got in. If used carefully, it improved comfort. If used carelessly, one suspects it improved local storytelling. Earlier and simpler versions of bed warming could include heated stones, warmed bricks, or containers holding hot embers, all introduced in some controlled fashion near the sleeping space. These methods show something important. People were not passively enduring cold. They were actively engineering small zones of temporary warmth with the tools available. They understood with great clarity that the moment of entering a cold bed was one of life's more avoidable cruelties. Another major source of warmth was other human beings. This is one of the least glamorous but most universal truths of pre-modern sleep. People shared beds. A great many people shared beds. Sometimes this was about household crowding, sometimes about custom, sometimes about hospitality, and very often about heat. We modern people, with our distinct mattress preferences and surprisingly intense pillow politics, tend to think of sleeping alone as normal and bed sharing as unusual or intimate. Medieval practice was less sentimental and more practical. Family members shared beds. Servants shared beds. Travelers shared beds at inns. Attendants slept near high-status individuals. Children clustered with caregivers. A bed full of warm bodies was simply warmer. Even when individuals had separate sleeping surfaces, they might share a chamber with several others, benefiting from collective body heat in a closed room. Privacy, as we understand it, was not the organizing principle. Survival, efficiency, and hierarchy were. So when imagining a castle night, or it is worth replacing the solitary candlelit sleeper of modern fiction with a more accurate scene. Multiple people in layered garments, under layered blankets, behind layered hangings, all trying not to notice the draft coming from somewhere impossible. To modern sensibilities, some of this sounds uncomfortable. To medieval sensibilities, comfort was relative, and freezing politely alone would have seemed a strange priority. The architecture of castles also evolved in ways that improved sleeping conditions over time. Early Norman keeps and military-heavy fortifications were notoriously stark. Life in them could be severe. But as the Middle Ages progressed, especially in more stable regions and in residences that served as both fortresses and noble homes, greater attention was paid to domestic comfort. Chambers became more specialized. Their fireplaces became more common. Latrines were integrated more effectively. Glazing appeared in higher status buildings. Decorative woodwork, wall coverings, and private apartments expanded. The Lord's Solar, for example, often served as a more private and comfortable upper chamber for the family, especially for daytime living and sometimes sleeping. It caught more light, could be better furnished, and offered some separation from the chaos of the hall. In many castles, the great hall remained central for ceremony, dining, and household gathering, but sleeping arrangements increasingly shifted toward smaller adjacent or upper rooms when status allowed. This did not mean the castle became warm by modern standards. It meant the upper ranks could concentrate limited warmth more intelligently. A great hall with a central hearth was excellent for displaying hospitality and feeding retainers. It was less ideal for sustained intimate comfort, so people with options took those options. That is not decadence. That is simply noticing that sleeping next to 40 snoring men and a dying fire was not the peak expression of civilization. Seasonal routine mattered too. Medieval people adapted their sleep habits to the rhythms of weather and daylight. In winter, longer nights meant more time indoors, more emphasis on textile layers, and more care in securing the chamber against wind. Servants might close shutters, hang extra coverings, bank the fire, bring additional blankets, and prepare beds well before the household retired. Candles were costly enough that darkness encouraged earlier bedtimes, though elite households could extend activity with artificial light. The transition to sleep, then, involved ritual and labor. This is easy to forget. Before one important person slept warmly in a curtained bed, several less important people had likely carried fuel, aired linens, shaken out coverlets, warmed the room, fetched water, secured doors, checked embers, and perhaps stationed themselves nearby for nighttime service. Warmth in a castle was not simply owned, it was maintained. The privilege of sleeping well often rested on other people staying awake a little longer in colder parts of the building. That is not merely a poetic observation. It is one of the more consistent mechanics of pre-modern aristocratic life. If the Lord's chamber was tolerable, it was because the household had organized itself to make it so. Let us linger for a moment on the difference between castles as seen in summer tourism and castles as lived in through winter. On a mild day, a castle courtyard can seem picturesque. Stone walls, towers against the sky, perhaps a hawk somewhere being symbolically medieval. In winter, every exposed surface became a problem. Water froze, wind cut through passages, spiral staircases acted as vertical channels for cold air, towers were scenic and appallingly difficult to heat. Upper rooms might avoid some damp rising from the ground, but they could be more exposed to wind. Lower rooms might be more sheltered, but colder from stone and lack of sunlight. The idea that everyone in a castle huddled around an enormous roaring fire all night is attractive, but not really accurate. More often, warmth was a patchwork. One room was usable, another merely endurable, another left mostly to storage, a stairwell completely hopeless, a chapel spiritually uplifting but thermally hostile, and a tower chamber suitable only for either military necessity or very committed guests. Castles were not uniformly occupied in the same way at all times. People gravitated toward the more manageable spaces, especially in bad weather. The social map of the household shifted with the temperature. What about windows? This is where a good deal of medieval suffering quietly entered the room. Glass existed certainly, especially in wealthy and ecclesiastical contexts, but broad, well-sealed panes were not standard features everywhere. Many windows were narrow for defensive reasons, and some were covered by wooden shutters, oiled cloth, parchment, horn panes, or lattices rather than full glass. Even where glass existed, insulation was not impressive. Leaded panes with small glass quarries reduced exposure but did not create modern comfort. Curtains over windows helped, shutters helped, stuffing cracks helped, but cold still found its way in because cold is historically very persistent. One reason beds were often placed away from windows and tucked into more protected parts of the chamber was simple self-respect. If a particular wall was known for leaking wind like an insult, sensible people did not place their heads directly beside it. Furnishings, too, could shape the microclimate of a room. Chests, screens, benches, and wall hangings all disrupted drafts and made certain corners more livable. Medieval domestic intelligence consisted partly of learning which parts of a room were not actively trying to kill your toes. Another thing that helped people survive the cold was diet. Now, we are not saying a hearty stew turns a stone fortress into a spa. It does not. But warm food, heavy bread, ale, pottage, roasted meat when available, and the general calorie density of winter eating mattered. Laboring bodies generated heat. Well-fed bodies held up better against cold. Even the elite, whose lives were certainly more cushioned, relied on a substantial evening meal and warm drink as part of the transition into night. The medieval body was not separate from the sleeping environment. Health, warmth, and rest were interconnected in humoral thinking as well as in plain experience. To go to bed chilled, hungry, damp, and exhausted was dangerous. To go to bed warmed by food, drink, fire, and layered bedding was survivable. This is partly why illness could become so serious in winter conditions. Cold alone was bad enough. Cold plus poor nutrition, poor ventilation, respiratory infection, or a damp sleeping space could be disastrous. So while our focus is on not freezing to death, it is worth remembering that many of the real dangers of castle cold were indirect. Sickness, weakness, smoke irritation, and the chronic strain of uncomfortable conditions. People survived because they had habits and systems, not because castles were accidentally pleasant. Let us also say something unfashionable in defense of smoke. Medieval fire technology was often smoky, inconvenient, and ruinous for clean lungs. But smoke could at least mean heat. Earlier halls with central hearths and roof vents left interiors darker and more soot-laden than modern visitors generally imagine. Yet such fires were the center of warmth and life. Even later, fireplaces and chimneys were imperfect. Rooms could retain a smoky smell, and textiles would hold it beautifully. Your blankets might be warmish, but they would also smell like every fire they had ever met. This was accepted. Modern people often want pre-modern life to be authentic, but somehow odorless. Medieval life declines that offer. Castle sleeping was warm enough partly because people tolerated levels of smoke, soot, and stuffiness that would now inspire product recalls. Again, survival involved trade-offs. If you wanted crisp mountain fresh air, you were welcome to enjoy it outdoors while reconsidering your decisions. The question of cleanliness also appears, because bedding in a castle had to contend with bodies, smoke, damp, insects, and long use. Linens might be aired, the blankets beaten, mattresses restuffed or refreshed, and beds stripped occasionally for maintenance, especially in wealthier households with staff. But regular laundering on a modern standard was unrealistic, especially in winter. That means warmth often came with a side order of odor and infestation risk. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, and moths had no ideological objection to noble households. Curtains and hangings that trapped warmth could also trap dust and vermin. Straw bedding needed replacement. Feather bedding needed care. Furs required attention. Yet none of this outweighed the value of insulation. If a tapestry also harbored the occasional creature with ambitions, it remained better than bare stone. Medieval life is full of these calculations. Yes, the solution has drawbacks, but the alternative is much worse. Another helpful point is that people in the Middle Ages were acclimatized to a colder indoor environment than most modern people are. This does not mean they were immune to cold or somehow biologically thrilled by it. It means expectation, clothing practice, daily routine, and exposure shaped what felt normal. If you live in heated interiors year-round, even a mild draft seems like a personal betrayal. If your world regularly includes unheated stone buildings, outdoor labor, seasonal smoke, and wool as a permanent second skin, your threshold is different. Medieval people still complained about cold. They still sought warmth eagerly. They still suffered in bad winters, but they were better practiced at managing without central heating. Their beds, clothes, and houses were part of a whole lifestyle calibrated around the fact that winter existed and had no sympathy. You, on the other hand, arrive from the modern world expecting a thermostat. The castle does not even offer an apology. We should also distinguish between castles in different regions. A castle in northern England, Scotland, the Low Countries, or Central Europe faced different climatic pressures than one in southern France, Iberia, or the Levant. Construction styles, available fuel, textiles, window treatment, and daily habits varied accordingly. Mountain castles and damp maritime castles presented their own special miseries. Some regions had more timber in interiors, which could improve comfort. Others had more elaborate domestic apartments by the later Middle Ages. In some places, braziers were more common. In others, open hearths dominated. So there is no single universal medieval castle night. But across regions, the same principles remain. Enclose the body, layer the bedding, reduce the air volume, use fabric generously, exploit fire selectively, share heat when possible, and accept that stone walls are fundamentally not on your side. Hospitality customs reveal a lot here as well. A valued guest was not simply shown a room. The room had to be prepared, often with ceremonial and practical care. Bedchambers of the elite could become semi-public settings of dressing, receiving, and status display. Yet when bedtime came, privacy curtains and well-arranged textiles transformed the chamber. Household accounts and inventories often pay considerable attention to bedding, hangings, coverlets, and the movement of such items. This suggests not only wealth, but priority. What object in a castle helped preserve life, status, health, and comfort across every season? Very often, it was the bed and everything attached to it. Armor may win poems, but bedding wins winters. One of the slightly comic features of medieval sleep is that the largest rooms were often the least useful for warmth. The great hall was impressive, central, ceremonial, and socially important. It was where authority was performed, justice dispensed, meals served, and community displayed. It was also cavernous. Heat dissipated upward, doors opened. People moved constantly. The fire served many. At night, if lower-ranking household members slept in the hall, as was common in many settings, their arrangements were comparatively temporary. Pallets, trundle beds, straw, cloaks, and whatever shelter could be improvised. Screens might divide areas or reduce drafts. The best spaces would be sought eagerly. But hall sleep was exposed, communal, noisy, and cold. We should not imagine every castle resident withdrawing into a private chamber at night. For many, the hall remained sleeping territory because it was central, supervised, and at least proximate to the main fire. To sleep there was not luxurious, but it might be safer than isolated corners and warmer than some peripheral rooms. Again, medieval practicality rarely flatters the fantasy. You went where the heat, the duty, or the rank allowed. Children present another interesting case. Young children often slept with parents, nurses, attendants, or siblings. This was practical for warmth, feeding, supervision, and space use. Noble infants might have cradles or small beds, but they were still within a managed household environment where night attendance mattered. The dangers of cold were especially serious for the very young, so textiles, proximity, and careful room choice were critical. A warm chamber with attendants was not just comfort for elite babies. It was life preservation. Elderly household members, the ill, and those recovering from injury would also receive preferential placement near heat if possible. Castle life could be harsh, but it was not randomly indifferent to vulnerability. Within the means available, people tried to protect those most at risk. Medical thinking of the period also associated cold with imbalance and susceptibility, which reinforced attention to keeping sleepers warm, especially the weak. Even the direction of the bed, and the arrangement of coverings and the night clothes worn might be influenced by a mixture of practical habit and learned belief. Medieval people did not separate medicine, environment, and daily routine into neat categories. They knew from both doctrine and experience that a chilled body was a troubled body. Then there is the matter of the chamber pot and the midnight journey, one of the least poetic but most thermally significant episodes of castle sleep. If you woke in the night, needing to relieve yourself, your choices were not ideal. In better appointed chambers, a pot nearby spared you a dreadful trip. In others, you might need to head toward a garderobe, privy, corridor, or stair. This meant leaving the bed fortress, abandoning your accumulated warmth, and entering the broad, indifferent cold of the building. Reheating yourself afterward was not guaranteed to be immediate. This alone helps explain why chamber pots remained beloved technology for centuries. Not every innovation is glamorous. Some are simply the difference between returning to sleep and lying awake in mortal resentment, while your feet negotiate with the flagstones. The medieval night was full of such small calculations. Do you get up? Do you stir the embers? Do you wake the servant? Do you add another blanket? Do you pretend that your hands are not freezing? History is, in part, the record of human beings making these decisions without electric light. Let us not forget roofs and upper structures. Roof construction mattered for retaining or losing heat. Timber roofs under lead, tile, slate, or thatch coverings varied in insulation and waterproofing. Leaks were not rare. Damp and cold together are far worse than cold alone. A room that stayed dry, even if chilly, was already comparatively blessed. Once bedding became damp from condensation, leaks, or improperly dried materials, the struggle intensified. Keeping bedding dry was essential. Chests protected linens. Servants aired materials when weather allowed. Fires dried garments and blankets. A chamber might be chosen not because it was the warmest in theory, but because it stayed the driest in practice. Castles were often built on exposed heights for defense. Hills are wonderful for visibility and dreadful for wind. What looked magnificent from a military perspective could feel personally insulting at midnight. And so castles developed all sorts of lived adaptations that do not show up in dramatic aerial shots. Extra shutters, portable screens, or layered rugs, stuffed cracks, moving sleeping quarters seasonally, and clustering activity in the rooms that behaved least badly. People were constantly negotiating with the building. There is also the matter of status displayed through warmth. We tend to think of status in medieval culture through jewels, clothing, servants, and ceremonial precedents, all of which mattered enormously. But to have a warm private chamber, thick curtains, a feather bed, fur coverlets, glazed windows, and attendants to prepare them was itself a major sign of privilege. A noblewoman in a well-appointed chamber might still feel the winter cold, but she was experiencing a refined version of it. A scullion on a pallet near the kitchen passage was experiencing the original text. Warmth was unequal, just like everything else. Even within the same castle, night divided people according to rank more clearly than daytime sometimes did. One person disappeared behind embroidered curtains and layered furs. Another rolled into a cloak near a bench and hoped the dogs did not choose exactly that spot. Both technically slept in the castle. Only one of them was under the illusion that civilization had progressed. If we imagine a winter evening from start to finish, the process becomes clearer. Supper is done. The hall grows darker. Household movement shifts from public bustle to private preparation. Fires are maintained where they matter most. Chamber servants or lesser attendants go ahead to prepare their master's room. Shutters are checked. Candles are lit. The bed is aired and perhaps warmed. Sheets are turned down. Extra coverlets are fetched if the night is biting. And someone may bring a hot drink, perhaps spiced wine or warmed ale, perhaps something medicinal depending on the household and the health of the sleeper. Clothing for the night is set out. The chamber pot is placed conveniently. The fire is adjusted. Enough heat, not too much danger. The lord or lady arrives later, after whatever final business, prayer, or conversation the evening required. Boots come off. Outer garments come off. Night clothes go on. Perhaps prayers are said. Perhaps attendants sleep nearby. Curtains are drawn around the bed. Inside that enclosed little world, with warmed sheets, wool layers, furs, and perhaps another breathing person sharing the space, the night becomes manageable. Outside the curtains, the chamber still belongs to winter. Outside the chamber, the castle still belongs to stone. But the bed has become its own country, and for a few hours, that is enough. This is really the central answer to our question. People in medieval castles did not defeat the cold on the scale of the building. They defeated it locally, temporarily, and socially. They made islands of warmth in a sea of masonry. They used bed design, architecture, fire, cloth, clothing, food, servants, custom, and shared bodies to keep the human core alive until morning. It was not elegant by modern standards, though it could look elegant from a distance. It was labor-intensive, unequal, smoky, and often imperfect. Yet it worked often enough that castle households continued across generations, produced heirs, received guests, survived winters, and complained in writing whenever conditions were especially terrible. There is something strangely comforting in that. Human beings have always been inventive when cornered by weather. Give them enough wool, enough blankets, a half-reliable fire, and a stubborn refusal to die of inconvenience, and they can sleep almost anywhere, almost, because in the next part, once you send TAE, we should talk about the details that made castle nights even more complicated than mere cold. The darkness, the noises, the smoke, the vermin, the midnight routines, the servants on floors, the guards in towers, the strange segmented sleep patterns, and the very awkward truth that even the warmest medieval bed could still contain several problems of its own. Let us start with the darkness, because cold is one thing and darkness is another, and medieval castles offered both with impressive consistency. Once the last useful light had faded and the final household candles were judged too expensive to waste on unnecessary wakefulness, the castle changed character completely. By day, even a grim fortress could present itself as a place of order. Servants crossing the hall, clerks carrying papers, dogs lurking optimistically near tables, someone arguing about grain, someone else pretending not to argue about grain. But by night, the familiar arrangement of rooms and duties dissolved into murk, half-heard movement, uncertain corners, and the quiet but constant reminder that before electric light, the world had a great many opinions about what should happen after sunset, and most of them involved uncertainty. A sleeping chamber could be made warmer, yes, but no one ever truly made a castle reassuring at night. The fire turned into red eyes in the hearth. The shutters pressed against the wind. A draught moved the edge of a hanging, and suddenly the entire room seemed to be reconsidering its intentions. One reason people often went to bed relatively early, especially in winter, was not merely habit or piety. It was because doing almost anything in the dark was inconvenient, costly, hazardous, or all three. Candles had to be paid for, lamps needed oil, torches were smoky, messy, and not something one wanted cheerfully wandering around heavy curtains and dry wood. So once the night routine was complete, many people simply got into bed and stayed there. The bed was warm, comparatively safe, and already paid for. The corridor outside was none of those things. This darkness also shaped sleep itself. Medieval and early modern people often experienced what historians sometimes call segmented sleep, with a first sleep and a second sleep separated by a waking interval in the middle of the night. Not everyone, not everywhere, and not in a perfectly identical way, but often enough that it appears in texts, medical advice, and daily descriptions. This means that sleeping in a castle was not always one smooth, uninterrupted descent into oblivion. You might go to bed not long after evening settled, sleep for some hours, wake in the deep night, perhaps pray, think, whisper, tend the fire, visit the pot, speak quietly to a companion, reflect on death, or simply lie there listening to the wind, abuse the shutters, and then drift into a second sleep before dawn. Modern people often treat waking in the middle of the night as a personal failure. Medieval people had a simpler view. Sometimes you woke up because the world was cold, dark, noisy, and full of unresolved theological tension. Then you went back to sleep. In a castle, this middle waking would have had its own atmosphere entirely. The first fire had sunk low. The room felt colder than before. The body, having been warm under blankets, noticed every patch of exposed skin with vindictive clarity. Somewhere in the building, a door thudded or a guard shifted position. Somewhere else, a dog barked once, then decided the matter did not justify further comment. If you were in a shared chamber, you heard breathing, snoring, coughing, muttering, and the small rustle of fabric, as someone else also discovered, that night is rather long when one lives inside an enormous stone argument. And this brings us to the noises, which could be almost as significant as the cold. Castles were not silent. They were quieter than daytime, certainly, but not silent. Wind moved through passages and around towers in ways that could produce moans, whines, rattles, and sudden knocks. Timber beams creaked, doors shifted in their frames, chains clinked. Animals moved in courtyards, stables, kitchens, and yards below. Horses stamped. Dogs rearranged themselves with excessive sincerity. Poultry, if near enough to hear, had no understanding of tasteful timing. Then there were the people. Guards on watch changed shifts. Late servants finished tasks. Someone coughed behind a wall. Someone else snored with the authority of a minor ruler. In communal sleeping areas, a single restless person could become everyone's issue. In more private chambers, the smaller number of people did not necessarily mean better sleep, because fewer bodies also meant every sound stood out more clearly. And beyond ordinary building noise was the medieval imagination, which was not notably short on demons, omens, wandering souls, suspicious weather, divine displeasure, and the general possibility that the night contained things with intentions. Now, whether individuals in castles actually lay awake, trembling at every groan in the walls, is a separate matter. People are usually less frightened by the familiar environment they know well than by the one tourists invent centuries later. Still, a castle at night could be eerie even without supernatural ambition. A large, old, only partly lit stone building in the wind does not need ghosts. It has acoustics. It also had smoke, and smoke deserves more attention than it usually gets in comfortable documentaries. Even when a hearth or fireplace improved warmth, it did not necessarily improve air quality. Depending on the construction of the chimney, the weather outside, the skill of the servants tending the fire, and the temperament of the fire itself, smoke could linger, drift back, or simply leave its memory on everything. Bed curtains trapped warmth wonderfully, but they also reduced airflow. This was useful when the problem was winter. It was less useful when the room also contained fumes, stuffiness, or the afterbreath of spent coals. Medieval people made these calculations constantly. Better a warm, somewhat smoky chamber than a fresh, freezing one. Better heavy hangings and still air than open circulation and frost-bitten ears. Better a small brazier's gentle danger than a noble death by pure ventilation. These are not the sort of lifestyle choices featured in modern bedding advertisements, but they were real enough. There were also serious risks. Braziers and enclosed heating methods could produce deadly fumes if poorly ventilated. Open embers could start fires. A curtain too near a flame was not romantic. It was a lesson briefly conducted and rarely repeated. So people slept between competing hazards, cold on one side, smoke and fire on the other, all beneath a roof built by men whose priorities had originally centered on arrows. Then there were the insects. One would love, for the sake of atmosphere, to glide past this subject with aristocratic indifference, but history will not allow it. Beds were warm, padded, had fabric-rich environments occupied by living bodies. This was an invitation that fleas, lice, bedbugs, and their various acquaintances accepted with professional enthusiasm. Castles were not exempt. Indeed, castles with their tapestries, furs, straw pallets, animal traffic, stores of cloth, and imperfect sanitation provided excellent opportunities for small, unwelcome life. A grand curtained bed might look like a sanctuary. To a flea, it looked like a thriving district. People knew insects were a problem, even if they did not have modern entomology. Bedding was aired. Straw was changed. Herbs might be used. Furs were beaten. Linens were washed when possible. Rooms were smoked or cleaned. But there was no permanent victory. The medieval sleeping arrangement aimed for tolerable management, not insect-free purity. This matters because the question is not only how people stayed warm, but how they slept at all under such conditions. The answer, again, is partly adaptation. If the norm includes an occasional flea and a certain amount of scratching, the threshold for complaint shifts upward. That does not mean people enjoyed it. It means they remained alive and continued to function while privately wishing the entire insect population a bad end. One suspects many a noble meditation on mortality began with a bite near the ankle, and if insects were not enough, there were also rodents. Not necessarily in every bedchamber, not every night, and not always in quantities dramatic enough to satisfy a horror novelist, but enough to be part of the broader environment. Grain stores, kitchens, refuse, warmth, and old masonry gave mice and rats opportunities. Cats helped, sometimes magnificently, sometimes in ways that suggested they considered rodent control a part-time art rather than a duty. Dogs were of mixed value on this front, often preferring emotional support to targeted action. Either way, the night in a castle was shared with more forms of life than a modern sleeper usually expects. The triumph is not that people found this ideal. The triumph is that they still managed to sleep. We should also talk about the servants sleeping on floors, benches, pallets, or in adjacent spaces because the relative warmth of elite sleep was sustained by a whole system of lesser sleep. If you were a chamber servant, valet, maid, nurse, or attendant attached to an important person, you might sleep nearby, sometimes in the same room, sometimes just outside it, ready to rise if summoned. This gave the master or mistress convenience and security, and it gave the servant an intimate acquaintance with drafts. A small truckle bed pulled from beneath a larger one might be possible in richer households. A pallet on the floor was also common. Floor-level sleeping, as mentioned before, was colder. Heat rises, stone remains unpersuaded, and the area near the threshold was usually where the room's worst ideas gathered. Yet someone had to be there, because aristocratic comfort traditionally improves in direct proportion to somebody else's inconvenience. A lady might sleep under a fur-lined coverlet in a curtained bed, while a waiting woman lay wrapped in blankets not far away, available for midnight needs, early dressing, or emergencies. A child of rank might sleep warmly because a nurse or attendant slept lightly. A lord might summon help before dawn because the page had spent the night being almost warm enough. In this sense, a castle at night was a hierarchy of fatigue and temperature. The closer you were to power, the thicker the textile, and the less your bones had to negotiate with the floor. This was not merely economic. It was spatially organized inequality. The warmth of the center depended on colder margins. And what about the guards in towers, gatehouses, and walls? Their sleep, or lack of it, deserves attention too, because not everyone in a castle was meant to sleep through the night. Watch duty did not disappear because winter was discouraging. Someone still had to observe gates, listen for disturbance, mark the hours, challenge movement, and remain unpleasantly conscious while everyone else pursued the second sleep. Guard accommodation varied widely. In some castles, there were chambers or barrack-like arrangements for men-at-arms. In others, sleeping might occur in available defensive spaces, whose main virtue was proximity to the duty rather than human comfort. Towers in particular have a certain legendary dignity in daylight and a much more practical problem at midnight. They are exposed. Upper rooms catch wind. Narrow slit windows admit little light, but enough cold to remain memorable. Spiral stairs are admirable for defense, and less admirable when climbed half asleep in the dark with cold hands. A guard coming off watch might not enter a soft chamber scented with herbs and warmed sheets. He might enter a room shared with other men, weapons, damp cloaks, boots, coarse blankets, and the dense smell of prolonged practicality. His body heat, laws like theirs, was part of the system. Men slept in layers, often keeping some clothing on for readiness, and likely did not undress into the vulnerable innocence of modern bedtime. To be warm enough and armed enough was a reasonable medieval compromise. Some military sleepers probably learned to rest in fragments, half from discipline and half from necessity. A fortress never fully ceased being a fortress simply because the hour was inconvenient. The night routines of prayer also shaped castle sleep more than modern retellings often remember. Medieval life, especially among the devout and the elite who were expected to perform devotion visibly, was structured by religious observance. Evening prayers, private prayers before sleep, Perhaps a chapel service or the sound of bells in monastic-influenced households all formed part of the nightly descent. If one woke in the middle of the night, prayer was a respectable use of that wakefulness. The darkness invited reflection, and reflection in a medieval context was rarely far from sin, death, judgment, saints, and the need not to embarrass oneself before eternity. Now, this may not sound especially sleep-inducing, but routine has its own calming power. To pray, cross oneself, speak familiar words, or follow inherited patterns before bed helped structure a world that otherwise included cold corridors and suspicious noises. Ritual domesticated uncertainty. A person going to sleep in a castle was not merely bundling the body. They were also arranging the mind. One reason medieval books of hours and devotional habits mattered so much is that they carried order into the most unstable times of day. Dusk, night, illness, travel, storm, and waking in darkness. The soul, like the body, preferred not to be left entirely exposed. We should linger on travel because guests in castles present another version of the problem. If you were visiting a noble household, your comfort depended on the resources and priorities of your host, your own rank, the season, and the degree to which the castle was functioning as a true residence rather than a military shell with ambitions. A favored guest might receive an excellent bedchamber with decent hangings, warmed sheets, servants, and food brought late. A lesser guest might receive what can only be described in diplomatic medieval terms as accommodation. Shared beds were not unusual, and bed sharing among travelers or guests was often accepted where modern people would start drafting firm policies. One bed, two men of acceptable status, perhaps a servant on a pallet nearby. Everyone fully aware that this was a practical arrangement and not a topic for future poetry. Hospitality mattered deeply in aristocratic culture, so a host had incentive to make a guest reasonably comfortable, especially if the guest mattered politically. But comfortable still existed within the limits of the building and the age. You might be honored splendidly and still wake with a cold nose because your host's most lavish chamber was in a century that had not yet met double glazing. There is also the question of what people wore to bed, and the answer is usefully untidy. The image of the medieval sleeper in a perfectly standardized nightgown is far too neat. Some people slept in shirts or shifts, some in partial underclothing, some in caps, some with additional wrappings, some likely more heavily dressed in severe cold or in communal conditions. Stockings, hoods, and nightcaps all had practical value. The rich could afford finer linen and better cloth. The poor made do with what garments they had, often wearing or keeping close the same layers needed immediately upon rising. In a castle, this meant the transition from sleep to waking was often less dramatic than our modern separation between daywear and sleepwear suggests. One did not step from a heavily climate-controlled bedroom into a heated bathroom to select between robes. One emerged from bedding into an environment still meaningfully cold, so garments had to be reachable, sensible, and not overly idealistic. The first few moments of rising on a winter morning in a castle must have required a degree of moral courage now mostly associated with polar expeditions. You left the carefully trapped warmth of bed, placed feet toward either a floor covering if fortune smiled or a cold surface if it did not, and began the business of reassembling yourself before the room could make other plans. This is one reason servants helping with dressing mattered. The wealthy could shorten exposure by having fire laid, garments ready, water brought, and tasks reduced. The poor simply moved faster and complained inwardly. Mourning, in fact, tells us a great deal about how well the night system worked. If people woke stiff, chilled, smoky, bitten, and unrested, then the castle's methods had only partly succeeded. If they woke reasonably functional, then the layering strategy had done its job. Not produced comfort in the modern sense, certainly, but preserved the sleeper in acceptable working order. Medieval comfort should always be measured with humility. The standard was not, would I choose this on a wellness retreat? The standard was, did I survive until breakfast without serious physical or spiritual decline? By that test, many arrangements were successful enough. Another subject worth discussing is illness, because cold sleep was never merely unpleasant. It was entangled with health. Medieval medical theory, shaped by humoral ideas, regarded excessive cold and damp as dangerous to bodily balance. Even without modern germ theory, people understood that chill could worsen weakness, that damp bedding was bad, that old people and infants suffered more, and that recovery from sickness required careful attention to warmth, diet, and air. This meant bed chambers for the ill or recovering could become especially managed spaces. More coverings, more fire, more attention to drafts, more attendance. Elite patients might be nursed in the warmest available chamber. Bed curtains could protect against chill. Warm drinks, poultices, and heated cloths might be applied. In short, the bed in a castle was not only a site of ordinary sleep, but of care. It is one of the quiet truths of aristocratic material culture that many expensive textiles existed not just to impress visitors, but to guard vulnerable bodies. Childbirth, fever, aging, injury, all happened in those beds. Their warmth mattered beyond mere nightly comfort. Indeed, for women in confinement after childbirth, warmth was often regarded as especially crucial. Chambers would be enclosed, heated, and attended more carefully. Again, modern people sometimes treat old furnishings as decoration. Medieval households often treated them as survival equipment with embroidery. The psychological dimension of shared sleep also mattered. To sleep alone in an isolated chamber could be a privilege, but not always an unmixed one. Shared chambers, nearby attendants, servants on floors, bedfellows, and family proximity all reduced certain kinds of fear. Humans sleep differently when other humans are near. Noise may increase, but so does reassurance. In a world without police on call, without electric lighting, without sealed windows, without climate control, and with very real risks from fire, illness, theft, and weather, not being alone had value. A lord had guards, a lady had attendants, children had nurses, servants had each other. Even in a crowded hall, the presence of many bodies made the night socially dense. This could be annoying, but it was also protective. A cry for help would be heard. A suspicious sound might be checked. A child waking in cold could be covered again. A fire problem might be noticed earlier. So, while modern ideals often place privacy at the center of good sleep, medieval conditions often placed community there instead, though community sometimes snored, kicked, or stole blankets. That, too, is history. We should not ignore dogs, because dogs in castles were everywhere and did not respect our narrative boundaries. Hunting dogs, guard dogs, household dogs, useless dogs of excellent breeding, all could influence the night. A dog near a hearth was a minor blessing. A dog under a blanket was an efficient source of heat and smell in equal measure. Dogs barking at disturbances could be helpful. Dogs deciding that a dream required an immediate howl could be less so. Still, animal presence in sleeping spaces or close to them was part of the wider ecology of warmth and security. Cats, likewise, might curl near bedding, patrol for mice when it suited them, or contribute a serene indifference that must have been emotionally stabilizing in an age of plague and tax. Medieval sleep was not merely human. It occurred in a household environment rich with animal sound, animal heat, animal inconvenience, and animal usefulness. We should probably say something about the smell as well, since silence would otherwise suggest an unrealistic cleanliness to the whole affair. A castle at night smelled of smoke, wax, wool, fur, bodies, rushes, timber, damp stone, food lingering from the hall, leather, dogs, occasionally herbs, and whatever the latrine arrangements were managing not to communicate. Some rooms smelled better than others. Elite chambers could be improved with fresh rushes, herbs like lavender, rosemary, or sweet-smelling strewing plants, incense in some contexts, and more frequent attention, yet no room smelled neutral. The bed itself collected the memory of the room and the people in it. Again, this was accepted. One does not expect a 13th century keep to smell like linen mist. One expects it to smell like a large animal made of politics. Curiously, these smells may have contributed to familiarity and therefore sleep. The modern craving for sterile freshness is a cultural habit. Medieval sleepers likely found the familiar odors of hearth, wool, and household reassuring in a way that would now be described, if one were feeling academic, as environmental recognition, and if one were feeling honest, as the smell of home. We should also touch on architecture designed specifically for later comfort, because not all castles remained the bleak stone boxes of conquest fantasy. By the later Middle Ages, many castles, especially in more settled regions, were increasingly adapted for domestic refinement. Private apartments multiplied. Windows became larger where security allowed. More glazing appeared. Fireplaces became standard in multiple rooms. Wall paneling and decorated ceilings added not just prestige but a measure of insulation. Garderobes were sometimes more neatly integrated. Gardens, galleries, hall and solar chambers reflected a world in which aristocrats wanted residences as well as fortresses. This matters because castle covers a wide range, from a harsh early keep to a richly furnished late medieval palace fortress where comfort, though still relative, had become a much more explicit design goal. In such later settings, sleeping without freezing to death was less a desperate nightly campaign and more a manageable inconvenience for the upper ranks. The lower ranks remained acquainted with the original problem, of course. Architectural progress has always moved unevenly through the social order, even in improved castles. Kitchens remained hot and laborious. Service passages remained drafty, and many servants still slept where their work required. But the existence of more comfortable apartments shows that elite medieval people understood perfectly well what better sleep required. They simply achieved it selectively, expensively, and with a great deal of cloth. Another quietly important factor was mobility within the castle and between residences. Great households often traveled with bedding, hangings, portable furnishings, and favored textiles. This was not only because nobles were decorative migratory creatures, though some were. It was because comfort was portable wealth. A bare chamber could be transformed significantly by the arrival of the right bed, the right curtains, the right quilts, the right tapestries. In an age without fixed systems of heating and insulation, luxury lived in things that could be carried and arranged around the body. The king or magnate was not warm because the building was benevolent. He was warm because half a warehouse had accompanied him. If one residence proved especially uncomfortable in a season, parts of the household might cluster in the better suites or move according to practical preference. The castle was not a static container. It was used intelligently by people who knew exactly which rooms were less hateful in January. This local knowledge mattered enormously. Visitors saw walls and towers. Residents knew the warm stair, the dry chamber, the smoky corner, the cursed draught by the south shutter, the bed that trapped heat best, the window that always complained in rain, the tower room no one volunteered for twice, and the kitchen-adjacent nook where a servant could almost imagine being comfortable if the cook was in a good mood. As such, knowledge is part of habitation. The castle was not conquered only in war. It was conquered every winter by routine. Let us imagine, then, a truly ordinary midnight somewhere in the later 13th century. The hall has gone mostly dark. The embers at its center or in its fireplaces sink and pulse. A pair of servants lie wrapped in cloaks against a screen wall, one already asleep, the other awake because his foot is cold and he has made the mistake of thinking about it. In an upper chamber, a lord turns under blankets and briefly wakes as the wind strikes the outer wall. He hears it, decides the wall can argue with the weather without him, and sleeps again. His wife wakes a little longer, partly because women often slept more lightly in households where children, servants, and responsibilities moved unpredictably through the night. Or she listens to the breathing of an attendant on a truckle bed, feels the warmth held within the curtains, and drifts back after a brief prayer to the Virgin and a mental note about some household matter that tomorrow will somehow involve linen. In a tower chamber, a guard comes off watch and swears softly at the cold buckles on his belt. He lies down fully clothed but for boots, pulling a coarse blanket over himself and another over his shoulders, because military masculinity ends where stone floors begin. In a nursery, a child whimpers once. A nurse half wakes, tucks the blanket tighter, and never truly leaves sleep. In a guest room, a lesser knight regrets the quantities consumed at supper, because the chamber pot is farther away than honor should require. In the kitchen range, a dog rotates twice and settles into the only truly correct sleeping philosophy of the age, which is to remain close to heat and take no position on theology. This is how people slept without freezing to death, not splendidly, not always deeply, not in hygienic solitude, but within a mesh of habits, objects, other bodies, and building knowledge. The question is not why castles were comfortable. They were not. The question is why people did not die of the discomfort more often than they did. The answer is that human beings are astonishingly adaptable when given enough fabric and social organization. Of course, hard winters still killed people. Poor housing still caused suffering. Illness still spread. Not every castle resident was safe. Not every night was manageable. But in the ordinary range of repeated winters, the systems held. The rich enclosed themselves better. The poor clustered closer. Everyone layered up. Fires were used strategically. Beds were fortified. Bodies were shared. Drafts were cursed. Night was endured. Morning was met. And then the entire business was repeated with very little expectation that the universe owed anyone central heating. This is perhaps the deepest difference between their world and ours. We think of comfort as a default interrupted by inconvenience. They thought of discomfort as the natural condition, with comfort something made, guarded, and deservedly appreciated when found. A warm bed in a medieval castle was not background. It was an achievement. It represented labor, wealth, hierarchy, architecture, animal products, textile production, domestic service, fuel supply, and competent household management all converging so that one particular person could stop shivering long enough to sleep. When you look at a medieval bed in a museum now, roped off, polished, dignified, and incapable of biting anyone, it is easy to miss that. What you are really looking at is a defensive structure for the night, a personal fortress within the fortress. Curtains instead of battlements, blankets instead of armor, a feather mattress instead of cavalry. But the same basic purpose, to survive what came at you from outside. Only in this case, the enemy was not an army from across the border. It was February, and February, unlike most invading armies, returned every single year. So the next time a castle looks romantic in a painting or respectable in a travel brochure, it may be worth remembering the actual sleepers inside it. The old lord with cold hands despite his furs. The maid on the pallet waking before dawn to relight the chamber fire. The guard stamping the circulation back into his feet on the wall walk. The child with a cap pulled low over the ears. The guest trying not to admit that the blanket is thinner than diplomacy suggested. The dog, frankly, having the best plan of anyone. They lived in stone, but they survived by cloth, routine, and each other. They did not conquer winter. They bargained with it nightly, and usually won by just enough to be annoyed again in the morning, which, in the end, may be the most human kind of victory there is.